Hey reader, welcome back to the channel, and this is Enter here. We are taking a look today at the Heartbreak Ridge scenario from the Commander's Compendium for Bolt Action 3rd Edition, put out by David Hasselfeld and Bo Mortensen from the Danish team. So feel free to take a look at it. I'll link, of course, down to it, as I always do, down below to their videos. They kind of talk about different stuff, and you'll find a link there in order to be able to access the Commander's Compendium. But just suffice it to say, this is an interesting one. I do like this one. It's kind of another take on the key positions, objective claiming style thing, but a bit different. It's got some control for the player, unlike some of the preset positionings that we've seen in some of the recent videos. But this one's interesting and it's very different. And I actually rather like it. I don't think it's my favorite out of the scenarios, but it is pretty cool and I really do enjoy it. So we'll take a quick look at just what the victory conditions are, how you play it. We'll take a look at which units are most likely to perform well, which ones might have a little more trouble. So you just kind of build your strategy around how to use those if you like those kinds of units. And then finally, we'll look at some deployment and terrain considerations. So first of all, in terms of things we need to know about the scenario, you're not allowed to infiltrate, though you can outflank. And I think that's fine because you're doing quarters deployment. Outflanking means you do have the ability to kind of, if you're willing to wait for a while, you can get men into those neutral zones. But there's no objectives in those neutral zones, so I don't see a problem with that. I don't think it's going to be too abusive. I would even on this one, I would probably lean away from outflanking, but at least you have the option, right? So for people who like doing it, it's always nice when you have that, and it's not going to throw too much off, which is great. The way it's going to work in terms of how you score is that there's going to be 3 objectives. One's going to be on the very center point of the board, right? So everybody's going to start beyond 12 inches of that point. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll start beyond 12 inches of the objective, because of course the objective is 25 millimeters, right? And you could go just to the brink of that 12-inch potentially, and then run up 12 inches, and then be within scoring range of the objective. So you could potentially have the middle objective as early as the first activation of turn 1. But you're going to have 1 in there, and then there's going to be 2 more, and they're going to be located somewhere within the deployment zone, right? Obviously, there are some restrictions. You can't put it directly on the board edge, right? Or anything like that. But, it's going to be somewhere within that deployment zone. You could swing it far to one side, far to another, so suddenly a neutral zone really matters. There's a lot of stuff you could do depending on how this works. But the important thing is there's only going to be 1 in each deployment zone beyond the 1 in the center. So there's only 3, okay? And at the end of the game, you score 1 victory point if you're in control of your home objective, right? The one that's in your deployment zone. You're going to get 5 victory points if you have control of the center objective, which is pretty awesome. And you're going to get 10 victory points if you're in control of the enemy's home objective. So there's a real incentive to push deep into enemy territory if necessary in order to get to their objective, clear everybody off of it, and claim it before the game ends. Now, there's a secondary victory condition, which I think helps a lot as well on this, because it adds a whole nother level of strategy and how you got to plan, which is you also get 1 victory point for each enemy unit that you remove. So you can't just throw away a ton of units so you can get to that back objective and claim it. It might still work because of the fact that it's a 10-point swing, right? And so as long as you can protect your own while getting to that one, maybe it is worth shedding 6 units or 7 units even in order to be able to get that one. Maybe so. I don't personally think I would run that. I feel like it just runs me too close to that margin that I would want, but it does mean there's a lot to think about in terms of how you go about claiming that objective. But it's a big, juicy apple that would attract you to go grab it because it's very, very appealing. So what we're looking at in this one, I think, is we're looking at an incentive towards strong claiming, big squad being dropped down onto an objective to claim it and make sure you've got it. Maybe follow up with a really big vehicle in order to maintain it and control it afterwards, just in case something happens to that infantry unit. But you get the idea, right? You want something that has staying power while combining that with the ability to remove threats, both because you're trying to keep people from getting to your objective in your deployment zone, because that's worth 10 points to the opponent. It's only worth 1 point to you, but hey, it's better than him getting 10, right? And also being able to rack up those extra victory points for each unit that's removed, right? So, you do kind of want to push deep in enemy territory, but you also kind of want to preserve your forces. It's a nice tension. I like this. And there are technically a couple of different ways. We're going to talk about this when we get to the deployment and movement considerations to go about it, because you don't technically need to push all the way in order to win this thing, but it certainly can't hurt. So what's going to perform well? Honestly, most everything. Not quite everything, but most everything. Big squads are going to be great because you want to be able to hold objectives. They're really good at holding objectives, especially ones you think your opponent's going to try to push you on. Transports are great because you can move up your men, probably taking less casualties, which is really nice. It keeps those big squads big, which is great. It can also be a great way of screening objective holding units, right? By providing cover for them. And we talked about this in our transport series when we talked about cover theory. Um, on the one hand, yes, your opponent can get a victory point by removing your transport, right? So you don't necessarily want to throw away your transports by using them as cover. However, if you screen a really big squad that's able to push deep into the enemy territory, take their objective, and then you park your transport as cover for them, that's providing maybe, soft cover if it's a soft skin transport, and then it gets blown up and you cough up a victory point to your opponent, but now it becomes heavy cover for them, for your actual claiming unit, and they can maintain control of the objective the entire game. You coughed up a point, you got 10 in return, right? Now suddenly, even if you have to cough up a few more units to provide solid cover and protection and firing, control for that unit in order to make sure that unit sticks around, it might be worth it to lose even a few more and you'd still be winning the game, right? So like, honestly, even if you lose the transport, as long as you lose it for the right reasons and as long as it's doing something advantageous for you, that's actually not a bad loss, right? It could be a really big swing. Light armor is also going to do great, mostly because, again, if you need something that's reasonably durable against most threats, often buttoned up, but at the same time can also remove a good amount of stuff, because of the fact we can score for removal, not to mention that tends to make it a little easier to keep objectives yours. That can be very effective. So again, light armor tends to come up as being highly effective. Engineers, if you really need to dig something out, engineers can be a really good way of doing that. And so, being able to take an engineering team, even a couple of engineering teams, maybe put those in some transports and use those to try to clear objectives, you can clear them pretty quickly. Pretty quickly. And clearing the objectives, especially that center and enemy objectives, is going to be essential to winning, probably, right? I don't think it's going to fundamentally come down to how many units did each guy destroy. I think it's primarily going to come down to who has which objectives. And that's good. That's, I think, what this is supposed to be as a scenario. But then finally, like artillery, machine gun teams, mortars, they're really mostly just good because, one, you can camp them on your own home objective, right? And they'll help to hold it, which is nice. Having more units holding an objective is always great. But in addition, it's good, just for suppressing, preparing enemy units for your advancing troops. A unit that chooses to go down in order to avoid getting hit really hard by a big howitzer is not going to be shooting at your units as it's approaching, which is really nice. So, I think there's a lot to go off of and a lot to admire about these kind of supporting units providing a relatively cheap way of softening up and preparing stuff so you can actually get victory points off of the units that are trying to hold an objective. Now, on the flip side, what's likely to struggle? Small infantry units, both because they're not going to hold an objective particularly well, they're not going to winnow down enemies particularly well, they're not going to do a good job of trying to capture an objective because they're probably slowly grinding down units, so the enemy has a lot of time to react to those units as they come up, and they're relatively easily removed for victory points. Now, obviously, a 4-man veteran section is going to be very different from, say, a 3-man inexperienced team or a 2-man inexperienced team weapon. But still, those small squads, they can be easily removed. So you just have to have a plan for how you do it. Maybe it's you're going to drop them out of a transport. You're going to drop out these things in mass. And so you're going to get it by just sheer volume of fire coming out from the number of units that are present in an area, right? But you have to build a plan around it. Okay. Similarly, infiltrators kind of get the shaft here because you're paying points for the infiltration rule. And yes, you do get the benefit of the cover save bonus, but you're not getting that forward deployment. In addition, infiltrator units tend to be smaller. Okay. Not all of them. We got some really big forward observer units now, now that the army of books are coming out. So, like you do have some forward deploying infiltrator style units that can be pretty big, but in general, they tend to be pretty small. So they are relatively easy to remove. Like they're not bad, obviously, right? Because you're still getting the cover save bonus. It is still nice to have things like a forward observer. It is still nice to have things, like an infiltrator, small rifle section or something like that, a scout squad, spot tripping squad, something like that. They're just, but they're losing something that they paid for just because, as you see there, infiltration, no, right? It's not allowed in this one. And then finally, heavy tanks. They're not horrible in general. In fact, for objective control, they're actually really nice because you run up, you take control with a, relatively soft unit, but a swift unit that quickly jumps onto an objective, and then you roll a heavy tank onto that objective, and it's going to be really hard to take it from you, right? The problem in this scenario is that while you could technically camp them on your own objective, it's not worth that many points to you. You're probably not going to get that much value out of that heavy tank, which could cost you the game. So you're really going to want to roll it onto that middle objective or onto the enemy objective, at which point you're getting really, really close to the enemy. So suddenly being DV10, DV11 doesn't matter nearly as much because you're probably getting that point blank range +1 penetration. It's a lot easier to get to your side or even to your rear armor. So suddenly, you know, something like a medium anti-tank gun is being treated like it's a super heavy or even better anti-tank gun. Could even be as high as a pen +8 if it can get to the rear at point blank range. Suddenly, being DV10, DV11 doesn't matter nearly as much, and the amount of points you paid to get to that level to try to keep you safe, it's I don't know, man. I'm just not sure that it's worth it. So, again, it's not to say you can't use it. It just means make sure that when you're pushing up that you cover your flanks well and that you're covering yourself with proper screening of infantry or whatever it is that you need in order to make sure that you're protected from threats. Okay? So in terms of deployment and terrain considerations, what do you want to think about? First of all, remember that objects in the objective, in the deployment zones are not necessarily where they appear. You are not required to place it in those specific spots. They can be placed anywhere pretty much within those ranges, okay? Just to kind of bring it back up for you. You do need to place it at least 6 inches from a board edge and at least 12 inches from the center objective, right? That's where the objectives are going to be placed. But it means you still have quite a bit of leeway, quite a bit of freedom as to where exactly you place it. So my recommendation is place it in a place where you're going to get cover for the units that are around it. It itself does not need to be in cover. But I would very much encourage you to make sure that any units you plan to have guarding it within its radius are within cover. Okay? So in terms of a cover perspective, you want to plan around central cover, right, to protect your units when you're going after that central objective. You want to plan around enemy deployment zone cover because ideally you want to be able to assault and move up your troops deep into enemy territory while also still defending your own objectives. And this means that the route that you might need to take in order to get to the enemy objective might require you to go through the neutral zone. It might actually be worthwhile to take a longer path to get there instead of trying to push straight through because you might have better cover and you might be meeting less resistance, which is nice. From a reserves perspective, personally, I wouldn't. Like if you know because of how things work that the enemy's objective is relatively close to one of the neutral zones, it could be worthwhile to outflank so you can quickly get into it. But I would just as easily just throw everything down, put everything down inside the deployment zone, and then once you've got all your men down, I would just rush through into the neutral zones and start pushing from there, right? Like, there's a lot that you can do in order to try to push forward against the enemy that does not involve having to put yourself on outflank and missing the first 2 turns of the game when you can get pretty far up the battlefield without having to outflank by just simply starting on the board and moving up, right? In terms of road access, once again, half tracks, wheeled vehicles go on roads. Keep everybody else off of it, unless you absolutely need the space to move something like, say, a big heavy tank because there just isn't enough space physically, unless it's a really big road, right? Or something like that. Your strategy here is crush and rush. You want to suppress down the enemy. You want to then just crush and remove the enemy defenders. And then you want to rush up and move up onto the objective, claim it as yours, and continue the push. Maintain momentum. Make it so that the opponent doesn't really have time to counterattack and try to take back anything that you've claimed because they're too busy trying to defend the next step or reclaim something that is really critical that they've lost because of the fact you were able to push so deep, right? Another thing important to think about is that if you get on that back objective and you don't need that squad or whatever to do something, just go down, right? Unless you are imminently afraid of being attacked, right? In close combat by somebody where suddenly going down means you're not able to shoot at them as they're coming in. It means that you're not getting the benefit of defensible positions. Unless that's the case, going down is going to help to keep your unit alive, which means you're going to keep that objective under your control. Okay? It doesn't work for everything, but when in doubt, don't forget to go down. Okay? Now, it's worth noting, and you can kind of see it when you're looking at the board here. Technically speaking, Do not feel when you're playing this scenario like you have to push into the enemy's deployment zone. Okay? It certainly can't hurt to get 10 victory points. There's that. But I think in some cases it could be a trap. Because if you have a strong, solid defense with good supporting fire units over there in your own deployment zone holding your own, and you can push up with a good, solid push on the center objective, and then you can keep the trading of order dice and how many order dice are removed equal with your opponent, you're winning the game. And you're winning by a decent margin, right? You could even lose an extra 1 or 2 above what your opponent loses and still be winning the game because of the fact that you're getting 5 victory points off the center that they're getting 0 for, right? You're leading on objectives 6-1. So you're starting with 5-point objective advantage, which means you could even lose 1, 2, or even 3 more than the opponent and still win the match. So while you can definitely push up, if you think it's overextending yourself and you're not quite comfortable going that far in order to get to it, you don't have to push up. You can give it another turn, right? Continue spending another turn, just pounding away into the enemy defenders, removing enemy units that might be trying to circle around or might be trying to take your objective. And then if an opportunity presents itself, then by all means, feel free to push forward. But if not, don't feel like you have to move forward. Feel like you can just sit there near the center, hold the center line, and punch against the enemy, racking up those secondary victory points just to help maintain your lead. Okay? You don't necessarily have to go all the way in. On the whole, I like this scenario. It encourages maneuver warfare. It encourages you to think about it from multiple angles. You don't have to advance all the way in. You can stop halfway. It removes a lot of potential gimmicks. The only real kind of gimmick that you might be able to find in this is if somebody could quickly shoot over and suddenly take the enemy's deployment zone 1 and there was nobody around who could possibly reinforce it for whatever reason. Then, you could have a sudden swing that just swings the points in another direction. And fair enough. I think that actually requires quite a bit of skill to do. So I wouldn't really call it a gimmick. I would just call it good generalship, right? So, honestly, if you haven't played this one, I'd say give it a try. I think it's a really well thought out, well designed scenario. It gives a good bit of agency to both sides. Even a lot of the units that you're taking, like there are ways to make them effective, which is nice. So, I'd say if you haven't tried this one, go ahead and check it out. Again, there'll be a link down in the description below where you can find access to the Commander's Compendium. And hey, give some feedback back to David and Bo on how it went. So that way they can make adjustments to the pack as needed. But honestly, as regards this one, I think this one's great. If you have any thoughts on, things that should be considered on Heartbreak Ridge, feel free to let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.